At this triumphant point, out of the blue, McClernand received a telegram from Grant. He was to halt operations and wait for a meeting with the general. It was time for McClernand to play his trump card, the president. He wrote Lincoln requesting more explicit orders and specifically an independent command, but he got no reply. And now vague doubts began to trouble McClernand's peace of mind. Sherman and other officers seemed cool. Somehow he had rubbed them the wrong way. Perhaps they were conspiring with Grant to get rid of him. Grant soon appeared on the scene with detailed plans for a campaign against Vicksburg under his own direction. McClernand would lead a corps, which, however, was stationed at the faraway outpost of Helena, Arkansas. Grant made a point of treating him politely, but everything together added up to a humiliating setback. Now McClernand exploded, writing letter after letter to Lincoln and Stanton to remind them of their earlier rapport and of the support they had once given him, and complaining bitterly about Grant. After days of fuming and writing, McClernand finally received a response from Lincoln, and, to his shock and dismay, the president had somehow turned against him. There had been too many family quarrels among his generals, wrote Lincoln. For the sake of the Union cause, McClernand should subordinate himself to Grant. McClernand was crushed. He could not figure out what he had done or how it had all gone wrong. Bitter and frustrated, he continued to serve under Grant, but questioned his boss's abilities to anyone who would listen, including journalists. In June 1863, after enough negative articles had been printed, Grant finally fired him. McClernand's military career was over, and with it, his dreams of personal glory. Interpretation. You will often come across McClernands in your daily battles, people who are outwardly charming but treacherous behind the scenes. It does no good to confront them directly. They are proficient at the political game. But a subtle one-up campaign can work wonders. Your goal is to get these rivals to put their ambition and selfishness on display. The way to do this is to pique their latent but powerful insecurities, make them worry that people do not like them, that their position is unstable, that their path to the top is not clear. Perhaps, like Grant, you can take action that thwarts their plans in some way, while hiding your own beneath the veneer of politeness. You are making them feel defensive and disrespected. All the dark, ugly emotions they strive so hard to hide will boil up to the surface. They will tend to lash out, overplaying their hand. Work to make them grow emotional and lose their habitual cool. The more they reveal of themselves, the more they will alienate other people, and isolation will be their doom. Reversal. It may sometimes seem therapeutic to outfight your rivals directly. It may sometimes be appealing to send an overtly intimidating message. But the momentary gains you may earn with a direct approach will be offset by the suspicions you arouse in your colleagues, who will worry that someday you will strong-arm them too. In the long run, it is more important to secure good feelings and maintain appearances. Wise courtiers always seem to be paragons of civilized behavior, encasing their iron fist in a velvet glove. "29. Take small bites. The fait accompli strategy. If you seem too ambitious, you stir up resentment in other people. Overt power grabs and sharp rises to the top are dangerous, creating envy, distrust, and suspicion. Often the best solution is to take small bites, swallow little territories, playing upon people's relatively short attention spans. Stay under the radar, and they won't see your moves, and if they do, it may already be too late. The territory is yours, a fait accompli. You can always claim you acted out of self-defense. Before people realize it, you have accumulated an empire. Piecemeal conquest. On June 17, 1940, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, received a surprise visit from the French General Charles de Gaulle. The Germans had begun their blitzkrieg invasion of the Low Countries and France a mere 5 weeks earlier, and they had advanced so far, so fast, that not only France's military, but its government as well, had already collapsed. The French authorities had fled, either to parts of France not yet occupied by the Germans, or to French colonies in North Africa. None, however, had fled to England. But here was General de Gaulle, a solitary exile seeking refuge and offering his services to the Allied cause. The two men had met before, when de Gaulle had briefly served as France's Under-Secretary of State for War during the weeks of the Blitzkrieg. Churchill had admired his courage and resolution at that difficult moment. But de Gaulle was a strange fellow. At the age of 50, he had a somewhat undistinguished military record, and could hardly be considered an important political figure. But he always acted as if he were at the center of things. And here he was now, presenting himself as the man who could help rescue France, although many other Frenchmen could be considered more suitable for the role. Nevertheless, de Gaulle might be someone whom Churchill could mold and use for his purposes. Within hours of de Gaulle's arrival in England, the French military sued for peace with the Germans. Under the agreement the two nations worked out, the unoccupied parts of France were to be ruled by a French government, friendly to the invaders and based in Vichy. That same evening, de Gaulle presented Churchill with a plan. Broadcasting on BBC radio, he would address all Frenchmen still loyal to a free France and would urge them to not lose heart. He would also call on any who had managed to get to England to contact him. Churchill was reluctant. He did not want to offend the new French government, with which he might have to deal. But de Gaulle promised to say nothing that could be read as treachery to the Vichy government, and at the last minute he was given permission. De Gaulle delivered the speech much as he had outlined it, except that he ended it with the promise he would be back on the air the next day. This was news to Churchill, yet once the promise had been made, it might look bad to keep de Gaulle off the air, and anything that would hearten the French during these dark days seemed worthwhile. In the next broadcast, de Gaulle was decidedly bolder. "Any Frenchman who still has weapons," he announced, "has the absolute duty to continue the resistance." He even went so far as to instruct his fellow generals still in France to disobey the enemy. Those who rallied to him in England, he said, would form part of a nation without territory, to be called Free France, and of a new army, to be called Fighting France, the spearhead of an eventual liberation of mainland France from the Germans. Occupied with other matters, and believing de Gaulle's audience to be small, Churchill overlooked the general's indiscretions and allowed him to continue his broadcasts, only to find that each new program made it harder to pull the plug. De Gaulle was transforming himself into a celebrity. The performance of the French military and government during the Blitzkrieg had been widely seen as a disgrace, and in the aftermath no one had stepped forward to alter this perception of cowardice, except de Gaulle. His voice radiated confidence, and his face and tall figure stood out in photographs and newsreels. Most important, his appeals had effect. His Fighting France grew from a few hundred soldiers in July 1940 to several thousand a month later. Soon, de Gaulle was clamoring to lead the forces on a campaign to liberate French colonies in Central and Equatorial Africa from the Vichy government. The area was mostly desert and rainforest, and was far from the more strategic regions of North Africa on the Mediterranean. But it contained some seaports that might be useful, and so Churchill gave de Gaulle his backing. The French forces were able to take Chad, Cameroon, the French Congo, and Gabon with relative ease. When de Gaulle returned to England late in 1940, he now had thousands of square miles of territory under his control. His command, meanwhile, had swelled to close to 20,000 soldiers, and his bold venture had captured the imagination of the British public. No longer the low-order general who had sought refuge months before, he was now a military and political leader. And de Gaulle was equal to this change in status. He was now making demands of the English and acting in a rather aggressive manner. Churchill was beginning to regret giving him so much leeway. The following year, British intelligence discovered that de Gaulle had been making important contacts among the growing French resistance movement. The resistance, which was dominated by communists and socialists, had started off chaotic, lacking a coherent structure. De Gaulle had personally chosen an official in the pre-war socialist government, Jean Moulin, who had come to England in October 1941, to help unify this underground force. Of all de Gaulle's maneuverings, this was the one that could benefit the Allies most directly. An efficient resistance would be invaluable. So, with Churchill's blessing, Moulin was parachuted into southern France in early 1942. By the end of that year, the increasingly imperious de Gaulle had so offended many within the Allied governments and armies, particularly U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, that a plan was discussed to replace him with someone more malleable. The Americans believed they had found the perfect man for the job, General Henri Giraud, one of France's most respected military officials, a man with a record far more distinguished than de Gaulle's. Churchill approved, and Giraud was named Commander-in-Chief of French forces in North Africa. Sensing the Allied plot, de Gaulle requested a personal meeting with Giraud to discuss the situation. After much bureaucratic wrangling, he was granted permission and arrived in Algiers in May 1943. The two men were at each other's throats almost immediately, each making demands to which the other could never agree. Finally, de Gaulle compromised, proposing a committee that would prepare to lead a post-war France. He drafted a document naming Giraud as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and co-president of France with de Gaulle. In return, de Gaulle got the committee to be expanded in size and cleansed of officials with Vichy connections. Giraud was satisfied and signed on. Shortly thereafter, however, Giraud left Algiers for a visit to the United States, and de Gaulle, in his absence, filled the expanded committee with Gaullist sympathizers and resistance members. Upon Giraud's return, he discovered that he had been stripped of much of his political power. Isolated on a committee that he had helped to form, he had no way to defend himself, and in a matter of months, de Gaulle was named sole president, then commander-in-chief. Giraud was quietly retired. Roosevelt and Churchill tried to intervene, making various threats, but in the end they were powerless. Those BBC broadcasts that had started out so innocently were now listened to avidly by millions of Frenchmen. Through Moulin, de Gaulle had gained almost complete control of the French resistance. A break with de Gaulle would put the Allies' relationship with the resistance in jeopardy. And the committee that de Gaulle had helped form to govern post-war France was now recognized by governments around the world. To take on the general in any kind of political struggle would be a public relations nightmare, destructive to the war effort. Somehow, this once undistinguished general had forged a kind of empire under his control, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Interpretation. Had de Gaulle announced his intentions, he would have been seen as a dangerous mix of delusion and ambition. And had he grabbed for power too quickly, he would have shown those intentions. Instead, supremely patient and with an eye on his goal, he took one small bite at a time. Because he proceeded in such a piecemeal fashion, no one really noticed what he was up to. When Churchill and Roosevelt realized how far he had insinuated himself into the resistance, and into the minds of the British and American publics as France's destined post-war leader, it was too late to stop him. His preeminence was a fait accompli. It is not easy to make one's way in this world, to strive with energy to get what you want without incurring the envy or antipathy of others, who may see you as aggressive and ambitious, someone to thwart. The answer is not to lower your ambitions, but rather to disguise them. A piecemeal approach to conquest of anything is perfect for these political times, the ultimate mask of aggression. The key to making it work is to have a clear sense of your objective, the empire you want to forge, and then to identify the small, outlying areas of the empire that you will first gobble up. Each bite must have a logic in an overall strategy, but must be small enough that no one senses your larger intentions. If your bites are too big, you will take on more than you are ready for and find yourself overwhelmed by problems. If you bite too fast, other people will see what you are up to. Let the passage of time masterfully disguise your intentions and give you the appearance of someone of modest ambition. By the time your rivals wake up to what you have consumed, they risk being consumed themselves if they stand in your way. Keys to warfare. The strategy works as follows. Suppose there is something you want or need for your security and power. Take it without discussion or warning, and you give your enemies a choice, either to fight or to accept the loss and leave you alone. Is whatever you have taken and your unilateral action in taking it worth the bother, cost, and danger of waging war? Which costs more, the war, which might easily escalate into something large, or the loss? Take something of real value, and they will have to choose carefully. They have a big decision to make. Take something small and marginal, though, and it is almost impossible for your opponents to choose battle. There are likely to be many more reasons for leaving you alone than for fighting over something small. You have played to your enemy's conservative instincts, which are generally stronger than their acquisitive ones. And soon your ownership of this property becomes a fait accompli, part of the status quo, which is always best left alone. Sooner or later, as part of this strategy, you will take another small bite. This time your rivals are warier. They are starting to see a pattern. But what you have taken is once again small, and once again they must ask themselves if fighting you is worth the headache. They didn't do it before. Why now? Execute a fait accompli strategy subtly and well, as de Gaulle did. And even though a time may come when your goal becomes clear, and when they regret their previous pacifism and consider war, by that time you will have altered the playing field. You are neither so small nor so easy to defeat. To take you on now entails a different kind of risk. There is a different, more powerful reason for avoiding conflict. Only nibble at what you want, and you never spark enough anger, fear, or mistrust to make people overcome their natural reluctance to fight. Let enough time pass between bites, and you will also play to the shortness of people's attention spans. Reversal. Should you see or suspect that you yourself are being attacked bite by bite, a quick and forceful response will usually be enough to discourage the nibblers, who often resort to this strategy out of weakness and cannot afford many battles. If they are tougher and more ambitious, that forceful response becomes more crucial still. Letting them get away with their bites, however small, is too dangerous. Nip them in the bud.